Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today on Central Booking, Connecticut's own Ren DeStefano. Ren is the author of the new thriller How I'll Kill You, about identical triplets who share a habit for homicide. Having survived abandonment as children and years of being bounced around the foster care system, Sissy, Iris, and Moody are now adults who do anything for each other, including killing their lovers to prove their undying commitment. But when Sissy, previously the cleaner of the three, makes the mistake of falling in love with her first target, the sisters may just find themselves at deadly odds with one another. As Lauren DeStefano, the author has written New York Times best-selling YA fiction, including the Chemical Garden trilogy and the Internment Chronicles. Born, raised, and still residing in Connecticut, she earned a BA in English with a concentration in creative writing from Albertus Magnus College. Ren makes her adult debut with How I'll Kill You, which earned starred reviews from Booklist, Library Journal, and Publishers Weekly. The latter praised, DeStefano does a superior job delving into the disturbed minds of the Twisted Sisters. This devilishly clever textbook of malicious mayhem is a must for Dexter fans. Now, join Ren DeStefano as she discusses the twisted family ties that will bind or break Sissy, Iris, and Moody for good. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Central Booking. I am excited to be in conversation with Connecticut's own Ren DeStefano today. She is the author of the hot new thriller, How I'll Kill You. There it is, which will be available from Berkley when you see this video. Welcome to the show, Ren.
Thank you so much for having me. And that's not a guidebook. It's fiction.
Yeah, right. It's not an instruction manual. It's fiction. I should tell that to you right now. It's a novel. So I have to say, I was so excited when I realized that there is some hot new Connecticut thriller author who I somehow managed to have not read before, though, you know, you're not a new novelist. You're just sort of new to this genre, but it's really exciting to have, you know, a fresh voice in this realm that I feel like I know so well. I've learned that I really don't know it all that well, but I'm thrilled to have you here. And so I will start basically with this question. You know, the twin story has been done before, sister stories have been done before, but I don't think that I have ever read a book about homicidal triplets. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind telling me, you know, what are the origins of How I'll Kill You, which is really a departure from your earlier books.
Yeah, well, if you do find a book about serial killer triplets that's not mine, let me know because I'd love to read it. That's definitely up my alley. I really liked the concept of three's a crowd. And I did think, you know, you see the evil twin, the good twin, and then I've explored a lot of sibling dynamics just in my children's books before. And I really thought about the idea that serial killers typically, not always, but typically fly solo. They typically fly solo. And I thought, okay, but if there's two of them, they would have to be bonded really closely to make sure that nobody cracks. They've got this really big secret. When you have three, it's inevitable, no matter how close three friends or siblings might be, two are going to be a little bit closer than the other. And that might shift and that might change with time. And I wanted to really play around with the dynamic and see how long they could keep this serial killer pact going before somebody broke.
Sure. It's such a diabolical little twist, and I love that. You take something that could be familiar, and then, you know, you add an extra twin in there, and all of a sudden, it's really, really fresh. So I have to ask you about Sissy, or she also assumes the identity of Jade. So if we speak of Sissy or Jade, they're interchangeable. They're the same person. So, you know, Jade is an assumed identity, so she sort of crafts her own self. But she is the cleaner of the trio, yes. Meaning that her job is really she makes bodies and crime scenes disappear. And so I wanted to ask you, given the advancements in forensics and technology and science, it's really, really hard to get away with murder these days, or at least it's a lot harder than it used to be in theory. So how did you familiarize yourself with the means and methods of committing and cleaning up largely undetectable crimes? And if you're going to incriminate yourself, you know, we can drop this question, but if not, you know, tell us how you looked into how you might be able to actually commit the perfect or almost perfect crime.
Well, there's a lot of strange Google searches, but I promise they're all researched.
And you use somebody else's web browser, right?
And it is hard to know because we live in a very digital age where it's very hard to get away with anything, thankfully, because I don't want murderers walking around. But it is a lot harder than, say, if I look at crimes from the 70s, 80s, where people just kind of seem to disappear into thin air. And if that were to happen today, there'd probably at least be more of a trace. So I had to make everything these sisters did take that into consideration. And so what they did is they picked a town in the middle of nowhere. They kind of drove through, scoped out, okay, there's not a lot of surveillance cameras. People have their guard down. Nothing bad ever happens here. Nothing ever happens here, period. And the victim that Sissy chooses is even somebody who pretty kind of confident in his safety, doesn't lock his doors at night. And so that was step one, was the setting. And then we get into Sissy's very practical belief that you can't hide a body. You just have to hide the evidence that you had anything to do with what happened. So she's very much about removing DNA, finding places that will buy her some time to hide a body. And just, but it all comes down to a protectiveness that she has for her two sisters, because they're the ones that are serial killers. And she doesn't want anything to happen to them, ironically. She doesn't want them to be put away in prison. She also knows she's heavily implicated and she would go down too. So it's everything about their lives. Their entire existence from morning until night is, how do we find ways to get away with what we're doing?
Sure. So for people looking for a reference point, I guess you could say, instead of My Sister, the Serial Killer, which was a very popular book, this is My Sisters, the Serial Killers. But so you mentioned, that she finds her mark in Edison, and then realizes that he has a bit of darkness to him as well, which she didn't initially realize. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how her initial impression of Edison changes as they become better acquainted, and then in what ways that sort of complicates her plan, because he is supposed to be her first kill.
So Sissy and her two sisters, their whole thing is, we have to put on an act and a persona. We'll dye our hair, we'll change our appearance, we'll adopt a personality trait, whatever, we have a past, to con people, to kind of lure them in with a false sense of security. And it never really occurs to Sissy that everyone else is doing some version of that. When you meet somebody new, they're not, even with the best of intentions, they're not just going to lay it all out there. You get to know people slowly. And so Edison, he was just a very polite kind of church-going guy, and he seemed really uncomplicated and unattached, and that was what drew her to him. He seemed like the perfect target. Nobody would be looking for him necessarily. But as time passed, she learned he's got his own demons, he's got his own things. But she still functions under the belief that his own kind of darkness still falls to maybe the safe and not criminal side of things. And so she's always wondering how far she can push him and what's there.
All right, sure. And so to expand on that, Sissy actually spends, so much time putting up fronts, for her family, for Edison, for her one friend, Dara, that she doesn't necessarily realize that maybe she's fooling herself too. So I'm wondering if you can tell us in non-spoilery terms, tell us about her journey towards self-discovery and how this sort of calls into question some of the assumptions that she's held as actual truths that may not be the case.
So the three sisters, what's interesting is they're identical, but they grew up separately. They grew up in the foster system in different homes. And Sissy in particular, just by random chance, ended up in kind of a nuclear foster family structure. And that shaped her perspective in a lot of ways, because compared to her sisters who were bouncing from group home to kind of abusive system, she was having a pretty almost average childhood at times, in pockets of time. And whenever things were good or she felt comfortable, she would look over at what they're going through and she'd feel this sense of guilt. And I think that taught her, okay, I cannot prioritize myself. I have to sabotage my own happiness. All that matters is that the three of us are together. And in her adulthood, she never really considered what her own wants or needs are. She's so focused on, we have to be together. All that matters is us. We were kept apart our whole childhood, and now we have to maintain this sense of control. And so when she ends up kind of going for this long-term con where she's trying to lure a man to his death, essentially. She has to play the part of somebody who would be desirable to, as a friend, as a member of the community, as a partner. And it all just feels a little too much like something, oh, I might want this. I accidentally stumbled upon something that I don't want to let go of. I don't want to destroy.
Sure. And so I want to ask you too, with the sisters, obviously from outside appearances, they are identical. They're sort of interchangeable, but they each have sort of very rich and different inner lives.
Mm-hmm.
And we get to know that, through Sissy's perspective. But I'm just wondering if you can tell us, a bit about Moody and Ivory as well. Who are they internally? And how did you get to acquaint yourself with their characters before you rendered them on the page? Because each is a dynamic character. And as you read the novel, you realize just how different they are internally, despite the fact that they look the same.
Mm-hmm. Without spoilers, I thought, when I started with the two sisters, I had a pretty, I start off when I'm writing any character with this sort of basic list of how I think they are. And I thought, okay, Moody is going to be the really reckless, impulsive one who just really wants everybody to stay together. And Iris is going to be the wild card. She's going to be very cool and calculated, but she's going to just snap on a dime and you're never going to know what's coming. And I kind of wanted Iris to be very ominous. Where it almost seems like she might just turn on them. She might be the one to betray them. And as I was writing them, their personalities really shifted. I learned a lot about their past, where they were from, and a lot of that changed throughout. But it wasn't just their relationship in relation to Sissy being their kind of the one that they're protective of and trying to help through this weird murder mission. But it was that they have very complex and very different childhoods that I wanted to get into, and they process them very differently. One became very stoic and quiet and just deadly like a shark in the water, and the other just very emotional all at once, angry, impulsive, reckless, dangerous.
Sure. And that's actually a good transition point to something that I wanted to ask you about, because as you've alluded to, each had an interesting childhood. There was sort of a cycle of abandonment and abuse, and they were
Mm-hmm.
put into the foster care system. And then there were a lot of separations and reunions, followed by
Mm-hmm.
more separations and reunions. And I'm wondering, what was your process like to acquaint yourself with the foster care system and sort of the emotional and physical trauma that can put upon people? And how did you want to approach that in your fiction in a way that was both sensitive, but also a reflection of the reality of what that can be for people going through that kind of experience?
That's a really wonderful question. So the foster care has been something I've always been interested in. And it started when I was in elementary school and I read The Great Gilly Hopkins. And I thought, oh, and if you haven't read it, it's a great book for all ages. I recommend it. Read it to your kids. But it's about a girl who's going through the foster system. And she is also very destructive. Whenever she's in any situation of happiness, she's resentful, she's bitter. And you learn, she's just been through it. She just wants some stability in her life. And I have a lot of friends who foster, and I see what that process is like. And I've also really observed the fascination that we had, especially in the early 2000s and the 90s, with sort of multiples on the news, right? So people who, I think probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, fertility treatments were really improving. And you were seeing, previously infertile couples suddenly having 4, 5, 6, 8 children, in a single birth. And you would see them on these talk shows getting money, getting, donations, getting all sorts of like cool stuff, but then they disappear and they have to go and live their lives. And you find out years later that the family might have really struggled. They might have, it might not have necessarily been, we saw all happy and sunshine and rainbows on the news, but they have to go be real people. And I think it was a combination of those two things where you have these triplets who were abandoned, and they were an anomaly. So they were on the talk show circuits. They were getting free tricycles and, like free little goodies. And then they went off and had very tumultuous and very difficult lives in foster care. Nobody really wanted them beyond the spectacle. And I wanted all of that to make them feel like they're human beings. That there isn't really necessarily an easy, or that appearances are never what they seem.
Sure. And so I wanted to ask you about the structure of the book as well, because I don't know if this is, a trend right now or if it's just coincidental to what I've been reading this year, but I feel like pretty much every mystery suspense thriller novel that I've read over the last few months has sort of been, dual timeline, multiple perspective. And so it was really refreshing for me to come back to a story that is a single, first person narrator who's telling a linear tale. It was like, wow, I've kind of missed this. It's not a new thing. I just haven't read it as much recently. And I'm wondering if you can tell me what appealed to you, about that structure, and what are some of the challenges of having to, accomplish all of your storytelling through one character's perspective, because I think that can certainly heighten suspense, but you also have to accomplish a lot through one set of eyes.
Yeah, I think when I realized I was dealing with triplets, I thought about third person, I thought about alternating perspectives, but then I thought it's better if we don't know what her sisters are thinking or planning. And I picked Sissy of the three because A, she's the one who's going to be on this mission to kill somebody, but B, because she's the most she sees things in a very uncomplicated way. Her sisters will say, you're the emotional one, you're the, but she actually is the one who can look at a situation unemotionally and remove sentiment and say, my sisters are doing this because they're this way, they've been through these experiences, they have this perspective, and I know that if I do this, they're going to do that. And sometimes she's right, sometimes she's wrong. And then also there's this calm about her where she says, okay, here I am, I'm going to dismember a body that my sisters have just killed. I know that this body is going to be found, but if I put it here, we'll have this much time. She's got that very practical, her brain is almost like a game of Tetris. Everything has to fit together, and it's almost inevitable that it can't go on forever. And so I couldn't find room for anybody else. And I thought, if this were Edison's story, Edison being her victim in this case, it would be like a syrupy, sweet Hallmark movie, right? Because it's this man who's been through a little bit of a rough time, and he's finally met the woman of his dreams, and everything's perfect, nothing is wrong, we're happy, we're smiling, right? It's just like this inspirational sort of tale. But from her perspective, it's just kind of like a Dexter situation, right? And so I couldn't find room for anybody else to be here telling the story.
Sure. So yeah, flip the channel, you go from Hallmark to, Lifetime or Showtime really, really quickly. It's a different kind of movie.
For sure.
All right. So I am going to move away from this book and into broader territory for a few moments, if you don't mind. But you mentioned this before, and discerning readers might recognize your face, might recognize aspects of your name, because you've also written pretty extensively under Lauren DeStefano, which is your proper given name, and Ren is just kind of a nickname. So I'm wondering if you can tell me what compelled you to make the transition from young adult or children's stories to adult thrillers.
Yeah, I think something people might be surprised about if you have a favorite children's author is that they're probably, at some point in time going to publish something outside of that. And so for me, I wanted to write adult. For my entire career, I knew that at some point I wanted to write an adult, and I didn't know if it would be like an epic historical, which would take so much research, or if it would be like a romance or a contemporary. I just had no idea. And I've always really been interested in true crime. And we live in the glorious age of podcasts. So I've had even more exposure to a lot of true crime and the amazing storytelling that the hosts of these kind of podcasts and YouTube channels will do. And I just kept thinking, I really want to fictionalize a serial killer story. I really want to write something like that. And it took about 5 years of me coming up with ideas, realizing it's a really exciting idea at 5 o'clock in the morning when I wake up out of bed and think about it. And then I'm not so excited 2 days later when I've written a couple of pages. And my agent was very helpful too. I was showing her some early drafts, and she was saying, well, these early pages might be good, but do you think you can keep this up? Or this is maybe too derivative of this, a lot of talking behind the scenes, just that kind of how things get made. But when I came up with this idea, it just happened to be when my brain was switched off. I was just relaxing. I thought, it's the end of the day, I'm going to sit here and just enjoy some YouTube, just some true crime. And the idea just came to me, started writing it, and then wouldn't you know, that ended up being the one after all that.
After you finally stop searching, it just arrives. I think that's so true of so many things in life.
It's happened it's happened with a lot of my ideas. It really has.
I always tell people, just as soon as you've given up on love, that's when you're gonna like meet the person that you're meant to be with. When you think it's never
Mhm.
gonna happen and you're gonna be alone together. Alone together. That's not what I meant to
Alone
say.
together.
You know what I mean? I don't know. Alone
The
together with
title right there, Alone Together.
yes. But I want to ask you too, young adult and children's books have certain hallmarks or benchmarks, as do adult books. How did you find the transition? What did you find to be most transferable from one genre to the adult books? And then how did you have to shift gears also? Because I would imagine that there's a bit of a learning curve as well when you're writing for different audiences. So some things might transfer, other things might be new. Can you tell us a bit about, the process of acclimating yourself to writing for an older audience?
So one of the hardest things I think was in my children's books, I always strive to have sort of a moral message of some kind, where at the end of the day, although the characters and the villains might be super complex, you walk away with a pretty clear sense this was the bad guy and this was the hero at the end of the day. And I tried to make complicated villains that you could in some way empathize with or at least understand, but it was still that's very much the bad guy. And I always wanted a sense, because I was writing for a young audience, I wanted to encourage them that goodness prevails. A lot of stay true to yourself. And I feel that as I sort of shifted gears to adulthood, I took a lot of the things I learned in my later adulthood myself, that sometimes you misread people. Sometimes you're positive that you know what's right and what's wrong, and that that's not actually correct. And so it was a little bit of a no man's land. And it was a little bit of being incredibly honest about what I've learned about people in my life, and how a lot of my own fears and worries have manifested. Because when I was a child consuming children's books, I was scared of that kind of trench coat figure in an alley that might steal me from my life, right?
Right.
But as an adult, knowing a bit more about the world, I know that you should be a little bit more wary and cautious of pretty much everyone. That when you watch the news, a lot of the time when there's like somebody who murdered his family or something, for example, right? It's always the neighbors coming out and saying he was a nice guy. I never thought he had a great job, wasn't a shadowy figure in an alleyway. So I think a lot of entering the territory of, good and evil, not always easy to discern. Good guys don't always win. In this particular story, the protagonist is the bad guy. she's a serial killer, and you get in her head. And what I hear from a lot of readers is, why am I rooting for this person? I can't help but want her to be happy and succeed, but I don't want her to kill somebody.
Right. No, that's a great point though, because as children, I think we really do see the world in black and white, and then you grow up and you realize we're all living in shades of gray, and we think that people are good or bad, but it turns out that there's so much ambiguity there, and nobody really is probably as good or as bad as we think that they are. So let me ask you this, and again, this is something that you sort of alluded to a few moments ago when you said it took about 5 years or so to really come up with the concept of this book that was going to take you from beginning to end. But in the acknowledgments, you call the story the light at the end of a very long and very dark tunnel, which I think is the reality for a lot of writers, because writers do tend to work in isolation, and it's not necessarily the idealized, romanticized job that a lot of people think that it is if you haven't actually done it. So can you talk about the reality, the real reality of being a writer, and how you sort of have to create a community of people who are familiar with that to help sustain you when you are in those dark periods?
Yeah, so that's incredibly true. Thank you for that question. I started writing in college, just started trying to find my voice. I went through, just when I was in college, a very hard time. I was experiencing the death of a family member, and it took me a while to kind of pull myself out of that. And when I managed to find an agent and actually ultimately sell a book, I was really taken aback that I had done that I had, reached what I thought was, at the time, at 24 years old, my life dream. I said, okay, I did it. If a meteor hits me tomorrow, I've done the thing I set out to do with my life. And I also thought, well, now that I'm here, I've got connections, right? Like I'm connected.
Right.
I can publish books. And that has absolutely not been the case. And as years go by, new blood enters the industry, right? Really talented young people who remind me so much of myself, 15 years ago. And you realize, okay, it's years have passed and I haven't had any kind of idea that I feel good about in a couple of years. And I have these wonderful friends that I made in this industry who are at varying peaks and valleys of their own career, where at the time one of my friends was in the same boat and hadn't had any success in a few years, and one was skyrocketing to number one simultaneously. And then it shifts, it goes back and forth, right? And so I started to realize that what I need to do is I need to take all the what ifs. What if this has already been done? What if this is too weird? What if this is just strange? And just say, well, then it is. I'm going to do it anyway. And you have to be willing to put in a lot of hours that are going to lead to nowhere. And it's not for the faint of heart, but I do think that anyone with that kind of perseverance will eventually get there. And you have to be willing to accept sort of that's the journey.
Sure.
And in terms of building a community, I think for anyone out there, whether you're just starting writing or you just sold a book or wherever you are, the best question that I was ever asked and that I started asking was, do you want hard feedback today or do you just want support?
Right. That's excellent because it's very different, the two, and you have to be in the right frame of mind, I think, for the hard feedback.
Yeah. And there are days when I'm like, okay, lay it on me. I need to know, is this no good? Am I wasting my time? Do I need to completely scrap this and start over? And I need to know that. And then there are days where I think if I heard that, I might just throw up my hands and say, I'm done. I'm going to go be a painter. I don't know. I'm going to do something else with my life.
Well, that's a great transition point again, because my next question for you, and I think you may have just answered half of it, but in reflecting on a creative life or a writing life more specifically, what do you think has been the best advice that you were ever given, and then the best advice that you were never given and had to learn for yourself throughout the process of actually doing this work?
The best advice I was ever given. So I'm guessing we can't swear on this podcast.
Oh, go for it.
So I sent this draft of How I'll Kill You to a friend. And this is a friend who had read absolutely everything over the past 10 years or so that I'd written. And she'd seen a lot of the garbage and a lot of the stuff that seemed really good. And then just perplexingly, nobody wanted and it went nowhere. And so when I sent her this one, she said, "This is special. Don't fuck it up." And that was absolutely, in my entire career, the best advice I've ever been given, because I thought about that, and that means something different every time you think of it. Yeah. Right. So sometimes that just meant, don't put it down today, work on it today. Sometimes that meant the scene isn't good, delete the scene. But either way, it was, you have something you should really care about. So whatever thoughts you're having that are discouraging you, don't let them win today.
Sure. That's great. And don't F it up. I love that. Stick that on a bumper sticker on a t-shirt.
It's a good bumper sticker. I don't know if it's probably a little bit offensive for the people behind you, but good advice. And I think probably no matter what you do in life, you need somebody to just say that to you. You have the power, you have the agency to decide whether or not you're going to allow this to happen for you.
Sure. And then beyond that, you had mentioned, a few minutes ago that you need to learn that sometimes you're in the mood for that hard feedback, and other times you need something a little bit more uplifting just to calm the turmoil that is a writer's life. But in addition to that, is there anything else that you've learned, throughout the process that was kind of a new thought to you, or that you didn't realize before you embraced writing as a career that you maybe wish you knew sooner, but really had to learn throughout actually the process of doing this hard work?
So I think like a lot of people that I see these days, I really romanticized it. I remember walking through bookstores with my fellow English major friends in college, and we'd look at all these books and think, well, these authors are all millionaires or immensely brilliant if they're not millionaires. And I even remember a friend saying to me, well, when you start looking for an agent, you really have to be careful because they're going to want to steal your ideas. Thinking sort of, we're gonna hit that one big idea and that's gonna be our one chance and everyone's gonna want to take it from us, sort of. And it was almost like that flame that keeps burning, right?
Right.
And so I really romanticized it, and I believed that once you hit this level, you're always going to be successful, and you're always going to get respect and admiration, and you'll be at the top, and that's it. You never make it or you're at the top. That was just kind of how I saw it. And if you picked any book off of a shelf in Barnes and Noble and told me this author's a multimillionaire, I'd just believe you. I would just believe you because I didn't have any point of reference, did not know. But what I have learned is it's just a career. It's a career like anything else. It's not that different than being an engineer or a tax accountant, really. And you're going to have really demoralizing times. You're going to question if I should be doing something else. Am I any good at this? Am I getting too old for this? Am I aging out of what I wanted to do initially? And so I think it's the romanticizing it might be inevitable anyway, because it's artistic and it's something that people are really, working hard to get into. But once you're here, it really is a job.
Right. No, thank you for sharing that perspective, because I think that so many people who haven't written or tried to write really do think that, it is as easy as sitting down at your laptop, opening up a Word document, and then words appear. And it doesn't really work like that. And I'll even say for myself, like, there's a reason that I spend a lot more time reading and writing about reading than writing something original. It's not for the faint of heart.
I've done a lot of coaching for writers that are trying to break into the industry, and the number one thing that they have to learn that can be hard is you may have had this idea for a decade or more, and this may be your special idea, but you need to accept that maybe you need another idea. Maybe like let this idea go. Maybe this idea is actually the reason you're not succeeding.
Well, we might have to have a private conversation later. All right, 2 more questions for you, and I will let you get back to life. They will be somewhat related, but a lot of people, are going to pick up this read, they're going to tear through it, and then they're going to be like, okay, well, I need something, in a similar vein. And since this is your first book in this particular genre, I'm wondering if you might have, recommendations for people looking for something with kind of the same essence. It doesn't necessarily have to be books, but it can be books, films, podcasts, anything that you might recommend that you think readers who enjoy this book will like.
So podcasts, yeah. So for sure, a podcast that I really love is Stephanie Harlow. And she also has a separate podcast called Crime Weekly. And Crime Weekly, it's her, Stephanie Harlow, and then a retired cop, and they break down some cases in the news and they offer 2 different perspectives, and they're very mindful to tell the stories of the victims and not to sensationalize, which is what I really like about them. They'll try to interview family members, get into the backstory and the personalities of the people that were impacted, which I really, really appreciate. And another is Bailey Sarian, who she has more of kind of an effervescence about how she talks about these things. But, I love the way that a lot of podcasts today have this talent for storytelling and really treating the lives of everybody involved with so much respect and care. So I would definitely say check those out.
That's excellent. Yeah, I love that it's become sort of such a dynamic medium. And like you said, you can actually get a fuller picture and the victims aren't forgotten about, or they're not just sort of characters. They're actual, real, fully fleshed out characters, which is nice because a lot of times, like you said, it does tend to be sensationalized. All right. So
people still care about them. People are still here wanting to tell their stories. Yeah.
Yeah, they're real people. And sometimes that gets forgotten in sort of the entertainment value aspect of the entertainment industry. So I have to ask, I know that this book was a journey, and then of course we all read it super, super quickly. And so something that took you years to write, we, read in hours or days. And then we say, but what's next? Because we need a fix. So are you at liberty to divulge anything about what we might be able to expect from you next?
Well, I'm definitely working on a couple of things. I really, it took me a while to find my voice and to figure out the type of story I wanted to tell. And what I liked about writing How I'll Kill You is that I really wrote about the girl next door, except she's a serial killer, and one of three. And so I would like to explore the idea. And I live in Connecticut, and although it's not necessarily the reality of things, I know Connecticut's reputation in the media as this like super rich country club state, right? That's not like 90% of the state, but there is that small percentage that has that. And so I would really like to write about, I think, the lives of what seem to be very pristine and well-regarded people who have also some twisty things going on behind closed doors.
That's excellent. I cannot wait to read that. And I tell you, after reading this book, I am looking at my neighbors differently, friends, family, looking at you. But anyway, in the meantime, while we're waiting for that book, readers can pick up Ren DeStefano's How I'll Kill You. You will love it. You will thank us later. Ren DeStefano, thank you so much for sitting down and doing the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.